Before we get started with today's interview, just a quick reminder, click the thumbs up, make sure you subscribe, and ding the bell so that you don't miss any of the great interviews that we have coming up. Now, on to today's interview. Welcome back, everybody. I'm really excited today because today marks the 100th episode on this channel since our relaunch. And today, for something different, I thought I would make an episode that is a request of several of the composers I've interviewed and a suggestion by many of you. So today, I'm going to tell you a little bit about me. And I've just realized that even though I've put out 100 episodes on this channel, I've never actually introduced myself. So I'm Sam Ecoff. I am the president of the Wisconsin Federation of Music Clubs, in addition to being a private piano teacher and a media composer. So what does media composer mean? Well, that means that I write music for television shows, sometimes movies, radio programs, and sometimes advertisements. My music has appeared on television shows from Supergirl to Parks and Recreation, The Tonight Show, Late Night with Jimmy Kimmel, Dr. Phil, Judge Judy, Top Gear, and Practical Jokers, Adventure Time, Cupcake Wars, Is It Cake, Dancing with the Stars, and literally hundreds more. At this point, I've written music for over 1,000 different television shows, which air all around the world. So today, I thought I'd give you an opportunity to get to know me just a little bit, and I thought it might be interesting to show you around this studio. You've seen this tiny little bit in countless interviews that I've done with other composers, but I thought I would show you a little bit about some of the weird instruments that live here and about how I work. So I'm going to start off by telling you a little bit about me. And you'd probably know if you've watched any of my composer interviews that the first question I always ask everybody is, do you come from a musical family? And it turns out that I, too, come from a very musical family. I grew up watching my father play guitar and my mom play piano. I recall distinctly when I was a little kid asking her one day to show me how to do that, as though it was like breaking an egg or ironing a shirt, like a simple skill. And so the interest was definitely there. One of the biggest influences on my early musical life was my grandfather. He was somebody who was musically uneducated. He couldn't read music, but he was someone who had a phenomenal ear and could play any instrument you put into his hands. He actually had a live radio show on Armed Services Radio during World War II when he was a pilot. And we would gather together at their house for dinner once a week. And I knew what would always happen after dinner is we would put on country and western records from the 1940s and 1950s and break out guitars and washtub basses and percussion instruments and wheel the piano over and just play and sing along with those records. And that was my earliest musical education. Getting to make music in this really fun musical environment where there wasn't a lot of pressure to perform. And it was just to develop your ear and do what we do here. And it's part of the fabric of our family. So it was a really great musical experience. Another really foundational thing that happened to me when I was a kid is that my elementary school had a fine arts day. And this is the day I looked forward to all year long because I knew on fine arts day, a salesman from the local music store would come in with his synthesizers and drum machines and hardware sequencers, and he would create a sequence of music in front of us, programming in all the parts and having it played back. And it was just such an exciting thing to see him work and to do this kind of work. And I knew as a second grader, this is what I want to do. That was the coolest thing I ever saw. And so I remember coming home and telling my mom about these synthesizers and that I just thought they were wonderful. And my mom said, I don't know a whole lot about that, but I have a record from when I was in college. And of course it was switched on Bach. And I wore out a couple copies of that record, listening to it over and over and over. And my mother also wisely said, hey, well, if this is what you're interested in, we should probably get you some piano lessons. And so I started with a local teacher. I was a horrible student, as all of my teachers all the way through college will no doubt attest. But part of the reason I was such a terrible piano student is that I was really not interested in playing music written by other people. I just really wanted to create my own music. That's kind of what led me to this career in writing music for television shows. I started composing while I was taking piano lessons. I would frequently take pieces that I was assigned and experiment by playing them in different keys or reharmonizing them or changing them or adding sections on that were my own creations. And this is something that drew the ire and exasperation of many of my teachers. And by the time I got to middle school, I became very interested in creating things that were completely original and was really supported by my instructors at school and given lots and lots and lots of opportunities. I was allowed to write write pieces for the band, for the choir. I was given the task of accompanying the school choir. When I got to high school, again, I was able to write music for the bands, the choirs, the orchestra. I was given the opportunity to even write an original musical, which toured internationally through the school. And it was just an amazing opportunity. I wrote incidental music for lots and lots of plays while I was there and had some excellent, amazing support from those teachers. I came to realize after a while that I needed to treat every single assignment I received in school as a musical assignment. So if I had to give an original speech, maybe it also needed an original soundtrack behind it. A report on Australia, I'm sure they have great music there, and I could create a score to go behind it. There are plays going on all the time. Well, don't you think those plays would be better with an original score behind them? Perhaps the dance team needs an original score for their competitions. Every opportunity I had, I tried to do music and to create my own original music. And this gave me a lot of really good experience even before I got to college. It was also in high school that I connected with a really important person who helped me get a foot in the door at some of the largest publishers in the world. Because of my friend Daniel Holter, we've been friends for 30 plus years and still going, I was able to work for Sony ATV, Universal Music, and APM, the largest music publishers of production music in the entire world. And working with them has been incredibly challenging because their standards are incredibly high. Now, I'm a guy who's working in a room in my basement, but Daniel Holter once said something really awesome to me. He said, it's got to sound expensive. We're all people who are working in a spare bedroom or in a room in our basement, but it can't sound like that. It's got to sound like major productions, like this, lots of money was spent on each of these records. And that has been a really, really good challenge for me as a composer. I always have to step up my game. I try to feel like every album that I turn in has to be the best thing I've ever done. At this point in my career, I run and manage the Modus Operandi production music library, which is distributed by Universal Music in the United States. And I oversee a team of 7 composers. Each month, we turn out a new album of music. It's an absolutely crushing production schedule, but I love it and I wouldn't trade it for the world. And I keep reminding myself that even on a bad day, hey, you signed up for this. This is what you wanted to do when you were a little kid and you have your dream. So, be happy about it. So it's a really good thing. One of the questions I get asked all the time is, how can we hear your music? And the answer is, you can visit the Universal Production Music website. I will link it in the description. And there are 800 or so of my most current compositions there, and you can listen for free. One of the questions I ask all of the composers I interview is, how did you find your sound as a composer? And that's an interesting thing because I tried a lot of different things. Given my love of synthesizers, early on in my career, I had a lot of synthesizers. I went really, really heavy into that and thought, this is my sound. This is how I'm going to attain my sound. And as time went on, my sound became more and more acoustic until finally I started realizing that I really needed some mallet percussion instruments. But going out and buying a rosewood marimba is a pretty major financial commitment. So I started small and I found a wonderful tenor or xylophone from the 1980s with rosewood bars, which was available for $75 on Facebook Marketplace. And that really unleashed a major, major creative milestone for me. It kind of became my sound. And as I realized that these Orff instruments were an integral part of what I do, I went and bought a whole bunch of more Orff instruments and eventually did get that rosewood marimba. I'll show it to you in a little bit. Something I started to realize the more I used the Orff instruments is that that was kind of an unusual thing, that not a lot of people who are professional composers use Orff instruments to make their compositions. And I came to realize that there's actually a whole lot of other kind of unusual instruments that are out there that might also hold similar interest for me. And thus began my quest to seek out instruments which were highly unusual, but also would fit perfectly into my sound as a composer. So what I want to do next is to spend a little bit of time showing you around my recording studio here and showing you some of these kind of unusual instruments that I use to write music. So one of the more unusual instruments in the studio is this instrument. It's an RAV made by only one company in the world, run by just 2 people. It's like an oversized, overgrown thumb piano. It is a 4-octave instrument, although they do also make a 5-octave model, and it is both acoustic and electric, so it produces sound acoustically by plucking the tines, and electrically by the use of piezo pickups which are built inside. So the RAV is played by plucking these tines. They are arranged in octaves. And you'll notice, if you look at the layout of the notes, that they're arranged in the circle of fifths. The notes which are here are duplicated over here so that you can play both hands simultaneously. The arrangement of notes in fifths also means that the instrument is isomorphic. By playing a melody here, I can use that same fingering any place on the entire instrument to transpose the melody. The instrument has a really beautiful music box-like quality to it when it's played. The RAV sits on this little melody grand piano. If you look closely, you'll notice it doesn't even have 88 keys. It is my experiment piano. I do lots of bad things to this piano that you wouldn't want to do to an instrument that was a better piano. But it has a very sweet little sound to it. In fact, Prince had a melody grand piano in his recording studio to his dying day. I have fitted this one with a mandolin rail so I can get the honky-tonk piano sound, and I do lots of other things to it, like putting cloth in between the hammers and the strings, or sometimes putting paper in between there. At the moment, I have it all tied up with masking tape between the hammers and the strings, so it gives a very unusual sound. Continuing on around the room from the piano and the RAV past my desk, hanging on the wall, you'll see this 7-string Chinese zither called a Guqin. It is fretless, so I will not embarrass myself by trying to play it for you and showing you how bad I am at it. But it is something that is workable with a lot of digital technology, making me sound like I can play in tune. Here we have some boom whackers. I have them set up on this stand so that I can pick them up and drop them on the caps, which makes a really pleasing bass sound. This is my writing workstation. It's kind of the central nervous system of the whole studio. The computer serves 3 basic purposes. 1, I have tens of thousands of sounds that I can use to create pieces. 2, it also becomes an audio recorder, so I can record sounds from microphones. And 3, I can then edit those sounds into finished compositions inside the computer. So that's what that's all about. Above that on the wall, you'll see a whole bunch of small boxes. These are guitar pedals. These guitar pedals affect sound in different ways when it's put through them. Continuing on around, we have yet another synthesizer with a few effects on top of it, and a rack of equipment. Most of the devices in this rack are microphone preamplifiers. They make the sound from microphones loud enough to be recorded. The other thing that's in this rack that's extremely important is this box. This allows me to get sound into and out of the computer. Next to these equipment racks, we have another synthesizer, an Indian harmonium, my loyal and faithful studio dog, Zoe. Hi, Zoe. And up here, this is my pride and joy. This is a modular synthesizer. You make sounds by connecting together the jacks of the various modules with patch cables, and then you can play one note at a time. It's certainly old technology, but it's a very different way to be creative, and I find it very inspiring. Behind each of these panels, there is a printed circuit board that looks like this. It took me 14 years to solder together all of these modules. Many of them are from kits, some are my own designs. And like I say, it's an unusual way to be creative. Sitting on top of the modular synthesizer is this instrument. This is an ARP 2600 from 1972. It was fully restored. Right next to the modular synthesizer is another rather unusual instrument. Under this red cloth is an instrument called the Guzheng. The Guzheng is a Chinese instrument. It's a zither. It has 21 strings, and it is tuned to a D pentatonic scale. So when you play the Guzheng, you actually tape picks to your first fingers and your thumb, and that's how you play the instrument. It features movable bridges, which allow you to tune the instrument, as well as tuning pegs, which are hidden under the end of the instrument. And when you play it, it sounds like this. You can bend pitches up. And of course, you can also bend pitches down. And you can use the string pressure to create vibrato. To improve the level of sound isolation between the control room, which is the room we were just standing in, and the studio, there are actually 2 doors between these 2 rooms. The 2 doors provide more acoustic insulation, and there's actually 2 separate walls here, which are completely detached. They look like they're connected, but the joint between the 2 is caulked so that you can't see that it's there. That stops sound waves from being transmitted from one room to the next. Of course, there is almost no way to get a perfectly soundproof room, but I can get about 100 decibels of acoustic isolation between these 2 rooms, between the 2 doors and the double wall. Come on in, let me show you what's in here. So this is the live room. This is where musicians will sit when I'm doing work with session musicians, which was admittedly a lot easier before there were a million percussion instruments in here. And I can comfortably sit 4. I can have a string quartet in here or a brass quartet pretty comfortably. And this room is wired through the wall to the control room that we were just in. So I can put up microphones here, connect them to a panel that's on the wall, and those show up right behind the big equipment rack that I showed you earlier in the control room. So this room has a lot of different instruments in it, and I'm going to quickly take you on a tour and show you some of my favorites. So one of the things that kind of defines my signature sound is mallet percussion instruments. So over here we have a xylophone. This looks like a vibraphone, but it's actually a distant ancient prototype of what became the vibraphone. This is called a vibra harp. It was made by the Guqin company in Illinois. I found it on Facebook Marketplace for only $200, and it was sadly missing its top bar. But there is a company where the Guqin company used to be in Chicago called Century Mallet, and they made me a shiny new bar for the top, which you can see lurking under that blue folder. And it's a very sweet, lovely sounding little vibraphone. Over here, we have some drums. I am not particularly great at drums, but fortunately there are lots of great session musicians around here who come and play all the time. And on the wall, we have some string instruments, including an electric bass, an electric guitar, a couple of ukuleles, and a guitar which is dedicated to Nashville tuning. Here we have a rosewood marimba from Marimba 1. It's a beautiful sounding instrument. And I told you before I was really into Orff instruments, and I wasn't kidding. So here's my collection of Orff chimes and resonator bars and xylophones. A lot of fun. And on the wall there are a couple more string instruments, including this instrument, which is a 3-string electric guitar from the Crappy Guitar Company. It's made from upcycled materials. Doesn't play that well, but it's a really fun instrument. This electric guitar is a baritone. Think of the original James Bond theme, a 5-string bass, and another acoustic guitar. Down below we have a few guitar amps. These are also wired through the wall into the recording studio, so I can crank them up to 11 and play as loud as I want and not deafen myself. I want to take a little time to show you some of the more unusual instruments in this room, beginning with this really cool handpan. It's called a RAV Vast. It's made in Russia, and it sounds like this. So this instrument is a Harpejji. Harpejjis are tapping instruments. It has 24 strings, and as you move up the frets, it moves up chromatically. However, as you move sideways from string to string, the instrument moves up in whole steps. So when you play, it sounds like this. These instruments are Japanese instruments called Taisho Kotos. They are a 5-string instrument. All 5 strings are tuned to a G. There's one low drone G, and then there are 4 additional strings, one tuned to a low G, and the remaining 3 tuned to a mostly unison G. The 2 sizes are for the soprano and the alto, and you play different notes on these instruments by pressing the keys which stop the strings at various lengths. So this is one of the rarest instruments in my collection. It is an instrument called the Yukyuu. So if you can imagine a Taisho Kotos with only 2 strings, again, both tuned to G, and but this time, instead of playing it with a pick, you play it with a violin bow. And the 2 strings are tuned in octaves, so the lower one is this G, and the higher one is this G. Again, you can produce different notes by playing different keys on the instrument. In addition to providing a great resting spot for all of my Orff instruments, these dressers house my collection of small percussion instruments. Each drawer has a different kind of instrument in it. So for example, this drawer contains every possible kind of shaker you could think of, from bata shakers to metal space shakers like this one. Makes a different sound when you mute it. Metal shakers, and wooden shakers, plastic shakers, all kinds of cool stuff like that. More shakers here. You have to have the indispensable egg shakers, more plastic shakers, even toy shakers, because each of them has a rather unique sound. There's also a collection of rattles from all over the world in here, including Africa and South Korea and all kinds of cool stuff like that, because each different piece needs a different kind of sound to it. This drawer contains all kinds of blocks and bells. You can never really have enough cowbell. All kinds of wood blocks, both actual wooden ones and synthetic ones, and all kinds of desk bells, things like that. And very ethnic sounding bells. All kinds of cool stuff. And a bunch of gankokui from Africa. This is the blown instrument drawer. I'll demonstrate a couple of these instruments. So this instrument is called the Hulusi. It is a Chinese free reed instrument, and it sounds like this. And what's interesting about it is because it has 3 pipes, it can actually play with 2 drone notes as well as the melody note. I do a lot of wacky music, and so I have things like slide whistles and canary and quack sticks. So as I'm giving tours of my recording studio, this is the point where people start asking questions. And the most common questions I get are, 1, can my band record here? And the answer is always unequivocally no. That's not really what I do. The studio's in my house, first of all, so having people come to the studio means they're walking through my house, and it's my family's space as well as mine. But the more important reason is that this space has been tailored for my way of being creative, and it's probably not particularly conducive to the way other people like to be creative. Not to mention the fact that I'm always so busy composing music and, well, now making videos, that I don't have a whole lot of time for outside projects like recording a local band. The second question that I frequently get is, where do you find all these instruments? And I find a lot of them used on Facebook Marketplace. That's one of my biggest sources. Some of it comes from sites like Reverb and eBay. But one of my New Year's resolutions was that I really needed to spend less time looking up weird instruments on the internet to buy and actually spending more time making music. Because it's become this constant quest for me, finding something new, something unusual, something cool that will kind of trigger my creativity. Each of these instruments, in a way, presents certain restrictions. Maybe it's a restriction of polyphony, that you can only play one note at a time. Maybe it's a restriction that it has certain scalar patterns that it tends to drive you toward. Some instruments have weird quirks in how they're played, and so it ends up leading you towards certain melodic patterns, because the things that I might do if I was sitting in front of a piano won't really work on an instrument like a Yukyuu or the Harpejji. So that's a big part of how restrictions play a role in my composing. Another big source of restrictions, of course, is the genre of album that we're writing for. And we have written in so many different styles at this point, almost 100 albums just in the last 10 years alone. And so it might be elevator music one day, the next day it's Asian drama music, after that perhaps it's final decision time elimination music for some kind of contestant show. Just a broad spectrum, from triumphant orchestral music to scary chase music to really scary slasher movie music to really relaxing yoga music. So having that parameter defined about what style of music it is, knowing that my pieces have to be between 2 minutes and 2.5 minutes long, having the restrictions that are placed upon me by the instrument I'm playing, and then also knowing how production music has to work in order to be useful for the television clients who use my music in their shows. That's another huge restriction, because I have to leave them lots of spaces in the pieces where they can potentially edit, because my pieces never get used in their entirety during the course of these shows. They're always used as a little section of the piece, perhaps 7 seconds here, 23 seconds there. And leaving little spaces, places where the piece can easily be edited so that it can come to a natural conclusion every so often, is a really important part of what I do. It's what makes my pieces more useful to my clients. Another thing people want to know is how it works when I write for a television show. And the answer is, I'm not doing custom music for most television shows. So I'm not being called by a particular show and saying, hey, we need you to write music for this episode. It doesn't work that way. Instead, I'm told by my publisher, we need music in this genre. And so then me and my team of composers will start writing pieces in that genre. Once we're finished and everything's approved, those pieces go up on a website of the publisher. Currently, for me, that's Universal. And then different video editors from different shows, music supervisors, will actually troll through all the music on that site, find things that they think fits well in that particular episode of that particular show. They will download the music, edit it into the show, and then when the show airs, I get a royalty. It's a really helpful way for those video editors to get a lot of music very quickly and to know exactly what they're getting. They're not going back and forth with the composer. Either they like that piece or they don't. If they don't like it, they move on to something else. If they do like it, they license it into the show. The other benefit for them is that they're paying a small license fee to use that music, as opposed to paying custom music rates. And custom music rates are much, much more expensive. So they're kind of incentivized to use the production music that like I write. The advantage for me is that that same piece will show up on hundreds of different shows and will have a really long lifetime. where it's continuing to make royalty income for me for years and years and years. The pieces I wrote at the start of my career 25 years ago are still making royalty income for me today. They have a really long lifespan. Now, part of that is that I tend to write for genres that tend to be more evergreen. I'm not chasing the latest trends in music. I tend to write things that are going to be useful for a long period of time, and that has served me really well as time has gone on. So if you have more questions for me about anything you've seen, or questions about what I do and how I do it, or my path as a composer, leave me a comment and I'd be happy to get back to you and answer your questions. So thanks so much for tuning in. Thank you so much for supporting this channel. I'm really grateful for all of the time that you've spent watching these videos, and I hope you've enjoyed today's video, and we'll be back in just a couple days with some more composer interviews. Thank you so much for tuning in, and have a great rest of your day.